Have you ever stood on a beach, looked out at the ocean, and just wondered, where does a country actually end? It's a totally relatable question, right? Instinctively, it kind of feels like a nation's territory should just stop right there at the sand. But here's the truth. A country's border doesn't actually stop at the beach at all. It literally extends straight out into the waves.
Let's go ahead and bust a common myth right away. You might have heard the term maritime belt before, and maybe you thought it was some special, entirely separate legal zone. Well, it isn't. The maritime belt is really just the old-school, historically accurate term used by early writers for what we now simply call the territorial sea. So if you hear us use maritime belt and territorial sea interchangeably today, we aren't just being sloppy. We're actually acknowledging how these rules naturally evolved over time.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely demystify ocean borders. We're going to use really simple words to break down the incredible journey from absolute historical ocean chaos to the highly structured, exact ocean maps we use today. It's honestly a brilliant story of how human beings managed to figure out how to divide up a massive space that has literally zero natural landmarks.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 6 parts. First, the starting line. Second, the history of the cannon shot. Third, mapping the ocean zones. Fourth, the innocent passage rule. Fifth, real courts, real disputes. And finally, number 6, international law at home. Okay, let's dive right in and zoom out from the coastline.
Section 1. The starting line. Why extend the border? So before we can measure anything out there, we have to ask the absolute most basic question. Why do countries even need to claim water in the first place?
The crucial point here is that a country's absolute ownership, its sovereignty, simply cannot stop at the coastline. Think about it kind of like a house. A house needs a private front yard for safety and for practical everyday use, right? Well, a country needs a maritime extension for 2 big reasons. First up is defense. You really cannot defend your coast if enemy ships are allowed to just park right at your doorstep completely legally. And second, resources. Countries need to control the fish, the minerals beneath the water, and those nearby trade routes. That's the fundamental logic behind all of this. Everything else is just drawing lines to figure out exactly how big that front yard gets to be.
And to draw those lines, you obviously need a starting point. In the legal world, we call this the baseline. In super simple terms, the baseline is exactly what it sounds like. It's the starting line, right at the beach where we actually begin measuring these ocean zones. Normally, this is just the low water line along the coast. And once you have this line locked in, you can finally start moving out to sea.
That brings us to Section 2, History of the Cannon Shot. Now you might be wondering, how did people historically figure out just how big this ocean front yard should be?
It's actually amazing how practical our ancestors were about this. Way back in the 17th century, a writer named Cornelius van Bankershoek proposed what he called the cannon shot rule. The idea was incredibly simple. A country's ownership extends out into the ocean exactly as far as its cannons can fire from the shore. Basically, it was a pure rule of survival. Your control follows your enforceable power. Over the 18th and 19th centuries, cannon technology standardized, and this concept hardened into the 3 nautical mile rule. But fast forward to the 20th century, total chaos. Countries wanted more fish, they wanted more oil, so they just started claiming up to 200 nautical miles for themselves out of nowhere. There was zero agreement. Finally, in 1982, the world came together and signed UNCLOS. That's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This agreement is essentially the constitution of the oceans, and it finally locked down the rules we all use today.
Moving on to Section 3, mapping the ocean zones. Let's go ahead and board a ship, sail away from our baseline, and map out these modern rules established by UNCLOS.
If you remember just one number from this entire explainer, make it this one right here, 12. Specifically, 12 nautical miles. Under UNCLOS Article 3, 12 is the absolute maximum limit a state can claim for its territorial sea. It's a fixed, completely settled number in international law today.
So let's walk through these zones together, using some simple analogies. Closest to shore, on the inside of our starting baseline, you have your internal waters. Think of this literally like the inside of your house. Full ownership and absolutely no foreign ships allowed without your permission. Next up is the territorial sea, pushing out to 12 nautical miles. This is your private front yard. You fully own the sea, the airspace above it, and the seabed below it, though there is one small exception we'll talk about in a second. Keep moving out to 24 nautical miles, and you hit the contiguous zone. Now, you don't actually own this water, but you do have enforcement power here to punish violations of things like customs or immigration. Think of it as your neighborhood watch area. Then comes the massive Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, which stretches all the way up to 200 nautical miles. Out here, you only own the resources, so the fish, the oil, the gas, but not the water itself. The continental shelf handles the seabed resources down below. And finally, beyond all of this, that's the high seas. This is the public park. It belongs to absolutely no one, and everyone has the freedom to navigate it.
Section 4. The Innocent Passage Rule. Let's jump back to that private front yard, the territorial sea. I mentioned there was one big catch to fully owning it, right?
Well, that catch is called innocent passage, and it's actually a massive hole in a country's absolute ownership. According to the rules, ships from other countries have the legal right to pass through your territorial sea. Why? Because global trade absolutely relies on transit. You simply cannot seal off your ocean borders and block critical global shipping routes. But of course, there are strict rules for the visitors. The passage must be direct and continuous, meaning you have to keep moving, absolutely no loitering. And most importantly, the passage cannot threaten the peace, good order, or security of the coastal state. Basically, you can pass through my front yard, but you definitely can't break my windows on your way through. Section 5. Real courts, real disputes. Now, it's really easy to look at a neat list of zones and think this is all just dry theory. So let's look at how these rules were actually forged in high-stakes, real-world disputes.
Let's travel back to 1951 for the famous Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. So, Norway has this incredibly jagged, deeply indented coastline filled with all these fjords. Instead of painstakingly tracing every single tiny indent at the low water mark to make their baseline, Norway just went ahead and drew straight lines from point to point across the water. This effectively pushed their ocean borders way further out. Well, the United Kingdom hated this and actually challenged them in the International Court of Justice. But guess what? The court sided with Norway. They ruled that if your coastline is deeply indented, drawing straight baselines is perfectly legal. The really crucial takeaway here is that international lawmakers didn't just invent this rule out of thin air. A real-world conflict literally forced them to write it down into UNCLOS Article 7. Let's look at another huge one, the 1949 Corfu Channel case. British warships were passing through Albanian territorial waters in the Corfu Strait. Remember our rule about innocent passage? They had every right to be there because it was an international strait. But suddenly, the British ships hit naval mines hidden in the water. The court ended up holding Albania entirely responsible for failing to warn the ships about those mines. This case brilliantly illustrates that sovereignty in your territorial sea isn't some absolute shield. Even if you own the water, you still have real responsibilities to the international community passing through it.
Section 6. International Law at Home. So, we've talked a lot about global treaties, but how does a specific country actually take this and apply it to their own local borders? Let's take a look at India. India's domestic law is called the Maritime Zones Act of 1976. If you read it, you'll see it perfectly mirrors the UNCLOS Treaty. It claims a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, a 24 nautical mile contiguous zone, and a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. This tells us something so vital. Domestic law isn't some entirely separate beast from international law here. It is literally a direct, local mirror of the exact same global rules.
Before we wrap up, we really need to bust the single biggest misconception out there. People constantly confuse the territorial sea with the EEZ, and they treat them as just one big blob of ownership. Let's make it super simple. The territorial sea is full, absolute ownership of the water, the airspace, and the seabed. The EEZ, on the other hand, is only ownership of the resources, like the fish in the water or the oil below it. Owning the fish is absolutely not the same thing as owning the ocean. In the EEZ, foreign ships can pretty much do whatever they want as long as they don't take your resources. So we've seen how a 17th century cannon shot evolved into the highly precise 12 nautical mile border we use today. It's a beautifully settled, incredibly stable system. But that leaves us with a massive question for the future. With these rules totally locked in since 1982, what happens tomorrow? What happens when new, advanced technology allows us to mine far deeper and fish far further out into the high seas, that massive public park that belongs to no one? Will the constitution of the oceans hold up, or is that old historical chaos going to return? It's definitely something to think about next time you're standing on the beach looking out at the water. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.